The battlefield stretched across the cold darkness of space. Hundreds of warships from the Xelari Empire hovered in formation, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. The Xelari were one of the most feared forces in the galaxy, their rule built on the ashes of conquered civilizations. To them, war was nothing more than a game they always won. Admiral Vorkath stood on the command deck of his massive flagship, the Tyrant's Claw. He looked at the enemy fleet before him, a small resistance force from a weaker alien race trying to fight back. It was pointless. "Charge the cannons," Vorkath ordered, his voice cold. The enemy ships tried to flee, but it was too late. In seconds, beams of red energy tore through them, breaking them apart like glass. Explosions filled the void of space, and the battle was over before it had even begun. Vorkath smirked. Another easy victory. But then, something strange happened. The sensors on the Tyrant's Claw beeped rapidly. A new object had appeared on their radar, just outside the battlefield. It was a ship, but its design was unlike anything the Xelari had ever seen. It was massive, bigger than any warship the Xelari had ever built. It moved without sound, without signals, without warning. And then it stopped. Silence filled the Xelari command center. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. "What is that?" one officer asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vorkath narrowed his eyes, studying the strange vessel. It had no markings, no banners. Its hull was dark, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. Even the scanners couldn't get a proper reading. The ship seemed to exist outside the normal rules of technology. Vorkath's gut twisted. Something about this was wrong. "Send a message," he commanded. "Identify yourself, or you will be destroyed." No response. He frowned. "Foolish. Fire warning shots," he ordered. The Xelari warships fired their energy cannons. Red beams shot toward the unknown vessel. And then, something impossible happened. The moment the energy bolts touched the ship's hull, they vanished. Not deflected, not absorbed, simply erased, as if they never existed. A shiver ran through the crew. "That's not possible," an officer muttered. Vorkath clenched his fists. "Prepare full attack. Destroy that thing." The Xelari fleet unleashed everything they had. Missiles, laser beams, plasma torpedoes, hundreds of deadly weapons filled the space between them and the dark ship. And yet, nothing touched it. The warship remained still, silent, untouched. Vorkath's heart pounded. Then, for the first time, the dark ship moved. It did not accelerate. It did not boost forward. It simply appeared closer. One moment it was far away. The next, it was right in front of them. The Xelari crew gasped. The massive warship now loomed over them, a shadow stretching across their entire fleet. It was like a predator staring down at its prey. And then, it attacked. There was no flash, no warning. The Xelari ships started vanishing. One by one, their strongest battleships crumbled into dust, breaking apart as if some unseen force had crushed them from the inside. "Wait is hey pping," an officer screamed. Vorkath's breath hitched. It wasn't a ship. It was a monster, a being of war and destruction. And it had only just begun. Vorkath stood frozen, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes were seeing. The battlefield that had once been filled with mighty Xelari warships was now eerily silent. Where once stood hundreds of heavily armed vessels, now there was nothing but debris and dust, floating lifelessly in the vast emptiness of space. The mysterious warship had not fired a single visible shot. It had not deployed any drones, launched any missiles, or engaged in any traditional form of combat. And yet, the Xelari fleet was being erased. Vorkath's breath came in short, sharp gasps as he clutched the edge of his command console. His officers were shouting, scrambling to restore order, but there was nothing to fight. Every attempt to scan the enemy ship returned gibberish. Every attempt to lock onto it failed. It was as if the vessel operated outside the very laws of physics. "This is impossible," a tactical officer whispered, his hands shaking. "There's no energy signature, no heat emissions. No." The officer's voice cut off as another auxiliary battleship disintegrated before their eyes. One moment, it was there. The next, it was dust, scattered across the void. "This is no warship," another officer said, voice trembling. "This is something else. Something beyond us." Vorkath gritted his teeth, refusing to accept defeat. The Auxiliary were the most advanced warfaring race in the known galaxy. They had conquered entire civilizations, crushed planetary defenses, and annihilated countless enemies. There was no force greater than them. And yet, in front of this thing, they were powerless. "Retreat!" Vorkath finally roared, his pride cracking under the sheer terror clawing at his chest. "All ships, pull back." It was too late. The warship moved again, if it could even be called movement. It did not accelerate. It did not turn. It simply appeared in a different place, as if space itself had bent to its will. Then came the voice. It was not spoken. It did not come from speakers or radio transmissions. It appeared directly in their minds. "Run if you wish. Hide if you can. It will not change your fate." Vorkath gasped, pressing his hands to his ears, but the voice was inside his skull. It was not in Xilari, not in any known language, yet he understood it perfectly. His crew screamed, clawing at their helmets, as if trying to rip the voice from their heads. And then, the true horror revealed itself. For the first time, the warship let them see. Through the ship's massive, pitch-black hull, eyes opened. Not mechanical sensors, not artificial lenses. Real, living eyes. Dozens, maybe hundreds, blinking in eerie synchronization, as if watching them, judging them. This was no simple machine. This was alive. A creation of war unlike anything the galaxy had ever known. A living nightmare. A predator designed for one purpose only: destruction. Vorkath's voice failed him. His hands shook. His entire fleet, the most powerful force he had ever commanded, was nothing more than a minor inconvenience to this being. And then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the warship vanished. 1 second, it was there. The next, it was gone. Vorkath gasped for breath, his heart hammering in his chest. The battlefield was empty now. The auxiliary fleet was reduced to less than a dozen ships. Thousands of soldiers and officers had been lost. But worse than the loss was the fear. The realization that something out there, something more powerful than any empire, had been watching them all along. And it had let them live. For now, silence filled the bridge of the tyrant's claw. No one spoke. No one moved. The surviving Xilari officers sat frozen in their seats, their faces pale, their hands trembling. The vast emptiness of space stretched before them, littered with the remains of what had once been a proud and unstoppable fleet. Admiral Vorkath's breathing was ragged. His hands clenched into fists, his claws digging into his palms, but he barely noticed the pain. His mind was still reeling from what had happened. They had not just been defeated, they had been ignored. The warship had destroyed them without effort, without hesitation, and then simply vanished, as if the Xilari were beneath its concern. The thought made his stomach churn. He had spent his entire career commanding the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, conquering countless worlds, crushing every enemy in his path. The Xilari were supposed to be unstoppable. And yet, the warship had proven that there were things in this universe far beyond their understanding. An eerie static filled the bridge, snapping Vorkath out of his thoughts. The communications officer, barely able to steady his hands, turned toward him. "Admiral." The officer's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "We're receiving a transmission." Vorkath's blood ran cold. "From where?" I don't know. There's no source. No origin point. It's just appearing in our system." A chill crept down Vorkath's spine. "Put it through." The main view screen flickered. At first, there was only darkness. Then, slowly, a shape emerged. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even an alien. It was something else entirely. A shifting, writhing mass of shadows. Eyes blinked in and out of existence across its form. Some humanoid, others wrong. Some too large, others too small, their irises burning like dying stars. And then it spoke. Not with words, not with sound. It spoke inside their minds. Your kind believes itself strong. Vorkath's breath caught in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice refused to come. The entity's presence was suffocating, pressing against his thoughts like a heavy weight. You build warships. You conquer the weak. You call yourselves rulers of the stars. The shadows twisted, shifting into something almost humanoid for a brief moment before unraveling again. But you have seen now. You are nothing. Vorkath's fingers dug into the console. Who are you? He managed to force out. For a long moment, the entity was silent. Then it laughed. Not a sound, not a voice, but a sensation, a feeling of amusement crawling through their minds like cold fingers. We are not your concern, Admiral. The warship's eyes blinked in unison, staring directly into his soul. Your concern is what comes next. Vorkath's stomach twisted. What? What do you mean? The entity didn't answer. Instead, the darkness on the screen rippled, and suddenly, a vision flooded his mind. He saw flames, entire planets burning. He saw auxiliary homeworlds, torn apart as if by invisible hands, cities crumbling, warships disintegrating before they could even fire a shot. Screams echoed across the void. Auxiliary screaming. And then, silence. The auxiliary empire wiped from existence, as if it had never been. Vorkath collapsed against the console, gasping for air. The vision faded, leaving behind only darkness once more. This was a warning. The entity's voice wrapped around his thoughts, colder than death itself. Leave this sector. Do not return. If your kind refuses to listen, then we will finish what we started. The transmission cut. For several moments, no one moved. The only sound was the distant hum of the ship's failing systems. Vorkath forced himself to straighten, his mind still spinning. His crew looked to him, terror clear in their eyes. These were seasoned warriors, hardened conquerors, and yet, in the face of what they had just witnessed, they looked like frightened children. The auxiliary empire had never known fear. Until now. Set course for home, Vorkath finally ordered, his voice hollow. We need to inform High Command. The officers hesitated. Admiral, do you think they'll believe us? One of them whispered. Vorkath didn't answer, because he wasn't sure if he even believed it himself. The vast halls of the auxiliary Imperial Command were eerily silent. Normally, this place buzzed with activity, officers issuing commands, strategists analyzing battle reports, admirals discussing their next conquests. But today there was only quiet tension. Admiral Vorkath stood before the High Council, his body rigid, his claws digging into his palms. He had given his report, recounting everything. The fleet's annihilation, the mysterious warship, the entity that had spoken to them. He had told them about the warning. But the room remained deadly silent. At the head of the long obsidian table sat Supreme Chancellor Xoreth, his piercing violet eyes locked onto Vorkath with an intensity that made even the battle-hardened admiral uneasy. You mean to tell us, Xoreth finally said, his voice low and dangerous, that a single warship destroyed half our fleet in a matter of minutes? Vorkath clenched his jaw. Yes, Chancellor. Murmurs rippled through the room. A few council members exchanged skeptical glances, some barely hiding their amusement. Admiral, one of them scoffed, do you realize how ridiculous this sounds? Half the fleet, taken out by one warship, and now you're here, claiming some phantom spoke to you in riddles. Vorkath's claws dug deeper into his palms. His pride burned, but his fear was stronger. I know how it sounds, but I saw it with my own eyes. We all did. He turned to the side, where his surviving officers stood. Their expressions were grim, haunted. Halbreth leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. And what did this entity tell you? Vorketh hesitated for a moment. The words still lingered in his mind, like a scar burned into his thoughts. That we are nothing, he admitted. That if we do not leave that sector, they will finish what they started. The murmurs in the room grew louder. A few of the council members shook their heads in disbelief. And you believed it? One of them asked mockingly. Vorketh felt his blood boil. I watched thousands of our best warriors get erased from existence. I saw warships vanish in an instant. I don't care if you believe me or not. The Xilari Empire is in danger. Silence. Then laughter. One of the older council members, his golden ceremonial robes shimmering under the dim lights, chuckled. Ah, Admiral, for a warrior of your rank, I expected more spine. Fear. From the great Vorketh. Perhaps it is time for you to retire. The laughter spread. A few others smirked, shaking their heads at what they saw as cowardice. But Chancellor Xoreth did not laugh. He merely watched Vorketh carefully, fingers tapping against the table. And what do you suggest, Admiral? Finally asked, his tone unreadable. Vorketh took a breath, forcing himself to stay calm. We must leave that sector. No more conquests. No more fleets sent to that region of space. If we ignore their warning, they will return. And next time, they won't stop with a single fleet. The room was deathly still. Then one of the war strategists scoffed and let an unknown power dictate where we expand. That is not the Xilari way. Then the Xilari way will lead to extinction. The strategist's expression darkened. Are you suggesting we are weaker than them? Vorketh locked eyes with him. I am saying that we have never fought anything like this before. Soreth remained silent, his sharp gaze unwavering. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. You expect us to believe, he said slowly, that we should abandon entire sectors of space because of a single warship. Vorketh took a step forward. With respect, Chancellor, if you do not, then this empire will fall. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, Soreth exhaled, his gaze lowering slightly. He tapped his fingers against the table once more, considering. You are dismissed, Admiral, he said finally. Vorketh stiffened. Chancellor. That was not a request. Vorketh felt a surge of frustration rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Without another word, he turned on his heel and left the chamber. His officers followed closely behind, their expressions unreadable. As they exited the council hall, Captain Relock, one of Vorketh's most trusted officers, stepped closer. They won't listen, he muttered. Vorketh's jaw tightened. No, they won't. They'll send another fleet. Vorketh didn't answer, because he knew it was true. And when that fleet entered that cursed sector of space, it would never return. The fleet moved with precision, an armada of warships stretching across the void. Battle formations were perfected over centuries of conquest, their firepower capable of reducing planets to dust. The Xilari Empire had never lost a war, never bowed to any force. And yet, Admiral Trezik felt unease coil in his gut. He had read Vorketh's report. The coward, the fool, the man who had returned from this same sector, raving about some impossible warship and the warning it had given. The High Council had dismissed his claims, and now they had sent Trezik to prove Vorketh wrong. The fleet approached the coordinates where the previous battle group had vanished. Their instruments showed nothing. No debris, no wreckage, just empty space, as if an entire armada had been swallowed whole. Trezik exhaled sharply. Scan the area again, he ordered. The bridge crew worked in silence, fingers gliding over glowing consoles. Seconds passed. Then minutes. Nothing, Admiral, an officer reported. Trazik clenched his jaw. Deploy recon probes. I want a full. A pulse rippled through space. It was not a weapon. It was not an explosion. It was something far worse. Trazik's vision blurred for a moment. A deep, resonating hum filled the bridge, vibrating in his chest, pressing against his skull. The lights flickered. The holographic displays distorted, flashing symbols and numbers that made no sense. And then, it appeared. A void in the darkness. Not a ship, not a structure. Something else. It shifted and shimmered, warping space around it like a black hole wrapped in metal. The warship. The one Vorketh had warned them about. Trazik felt the blood drain from his face. The sheer size of it dwarfed even their largest dreadnoughts. Its surface was smooth yet impossibly complex, etched with markings that pulsed with an eerie ancient energy. It had no visible weapons, no openings, just an overwhelming presence. Admiral. The officer's voice was barely a whisper. The bridge was frozen. Every crew member staring at the thing before them. A voice, calm, hollow, inhuman, echoed through the ship. We warned you. Trazik's breath caught. The voice was not coming from their communication system. It was inside his head. You did not listen. The ship moved. Not with thrusters. Not with any propulsion that Xilari could understand. One moment, it was distant. The next, it was there, impossibly close, looming over them like a god staring down at insects. Raise shields. Trazik barked. All ships, prepare to fire. A heartbeat passed. Then another. Nothing happened. Admiral. A technician choked out. Our weapons. They're offline. Trazik spun toward the displays. Every system, shields, weapons, engines, was flickering between active and dead. It was as if reality itself couldn't decide whether they existed or not. Then the warship's hull began to glow. No beams of light, no missile launches, no impact. Instead, the Xilari fleet began to disappear. One by one, ships blinked out of existence. No explosions, no debris, just gone. Trazik's dreadnought trembled. His crew screamed. His own body felt light, like he was being pulled away from himself. He tried to move, to shout, to fight. But his voice never left his throat. Then, the warship spoke one last time. Your empire will fall, not by war, not by fire, but by the fear you refuse to heed. And the flagship of the Xilari fleet vanished. Silence. A vast, empty silence stretched where once the mighty Xilari fleet had floated, where warships bristling with weapons had loomed with the confidence of an empire that had never known defeat. Now, there was nothing. No wreckage, no distress calls, no trace of the thousands of soldiers who had been aboard the armada. The warship, that thing, had erased them from existence. On the distant capital world of Xilari Prime, deep within the War Council chambers, panic was setting in. Admiral Trazik's fleet had been one of the largest the Empire had ever deployed. Their strongest dreadnoughts, their most advanced technology, gone. And there was no explanation. The high-ranking officials stared at the incomplete data stream that had been received before the fleet vanished. A single distorted message had made it through. We warned you. It was the last transmission from Trazik's ship. The Supreme Chancellor of the Xilari, Lord Vorak, stood in the center of the War Council chamber, his claws flexing in agitation. His dark eyes flicked from screen to screen, watching the frantic intelligence officers and fleet commanders scramble for answers. This is impossible, one of the admirals muttered. Our ships had defenses beyond anything in the galaxy. Shields that could withstand planetary bombardments, weapons capable of breaking moons in half. There is no force in existence that can erase a fleet that large without a trace. And yet, Vorak said coldly, it happened. Silence settled over the chamber. The unknown warship was still out there, and it had given them a warning that the Xilari had ignored. One of the analysts spoke up, her voice trembling. Sir, we detected an anomaly before Admiral Trazik's fleet vanished. Some kind of energy fluctuation beyond our spectrum of understanding. Meaning? Vorak snapped. We have no idea what it was. A murmur spread through the chamber. For the Xilari, who had conquered dozens of civilizations and stood unmatched in technological dominance, not knowing was a rare and terrifying thing. Vorak turned toward the central display, which projected a three-dimensional image of their galactic map. The region where the fleet had disappeared now pulsed in red. Send another fleet, a general suggested, his voice uncertain. A larger one, twice the size of Trazik's. And if they disappear too, another countered. Then we send more. Vorak's claws scraped against the polished stone of the council table. They didn't understand. This was not a battle they could win by throwing more ships into the void. This was something else. Something that made even their superpower empire tremble. Vorak took a slow breath. No, we will not send another fleet. The room erupted. Protests, demands, outrage. Silence. Vorak's voice boomed. The chamber shook as his command echoed through it. We are not dealing with a simple enemy. We are dealing with something that has power beyond our comprehension. He turned toward one of his intelligence officers. Summon the Inquisitors. All of them. Have them search the archives. Every legend, every myth, every forbidden text about ships that should not exist. But, Chancellor, those are just. They are our only lead, Vorak growled. The Xilari did not believe in superstition. They believed in power. But this warship was beyond power. It was beyond their science, their weapons, their technology. It was something ancient, something patient, and it had already shown them mercy once. Would it do so again? The Supreme Chancellor stood alone in his chamber, staring at the deep void of space through the towering glass walls. Xilari Prime's twin moons bathed the capital in pale light, but even their glow felt dimmer beneath the weight of what had transpired. An entire fleet, gone, not destroyed, not defeated, erased. Vorak had ruled with absolute power for decades. He had witnessed planetary rebellions crushed, empires shattered beneath the weight of Xilari might. The thought that someone, could make them vanish like whispers in the wind made his blood run cold. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think. The Inquisitors had spent days buried in the deepest levels of the archives, combing through ancient records, texts so old that some had not been touched in centuries. They had worked in silence, translating forbidden scripts, cross-referencing lost histories. And now, they had found something. A single word. A name. Vorak's claws curled against his palm as the lead Inquisitor entered the chamber, clad in the dark robes of the Order. Speak, Vorak ordered. The Inquisitor's voice was barely above a whisper. The warship is not of this time. Supreme Chancellor. Vorak narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? It does not belong to this era. It is older than the Xilari Empire, older than any civilization we have recorded. There are fragmented texts, half-burned scrolls, erased data cores, that speak of a ship that was never built, but always existed. Vorak's breath slowed. The Inquisitor continued, her fingers tightening around the ancient data tablet in her hands. It was called the Vanguard of the Lost, a relic from a time before recorded history, a weapon forged not by mortals, but by a force that sought to end all war. Vorak scoffed. A fable. A myth told by dying empires. Then explain why our fleets vanish without a trace. The Inquisitor replied, her voice steady. A tense silence filled the chamber. Vorak had no answer. The Inquisitor took a step closer. Supreme Chancellor, our science cannot comprehend this entity. It does not fight war. It prevents it. Every record we found says the same thing. Those who attempt conquest in its presence do not die. They are simply removed. Vorak turned toward the void outside. Removed to where? We do not know. A quiet dread settled over him. For all the Xilari's power, For all their dominion over the stars, they had never faced something that could make them disappear. The vanguard of the lost was not a warship. It was judgment. A force that had awakened after millennia of slumber. A force that had watched them, weighed them, and decided they were unworthy. Vorek's jaw tightened. The Xelari were conquerors. They had never known submission. And yet, for the first time, Vorek wondered if they had already lost. His thoughts were interrupted by a deep, resonating hum. The Inquisitor gasped. Every screen in the chamber flickered. Every light dimmed. And then Vorek heard it. "We warned you." The words did not come from the speakers. They did not echo through the walls. They were inside his mind. Cold, ancient, final. Outside, beyond the capital's orbit, the stars shifted. The warship had arrived. And this time, there would be no warnings.